Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: President Trump announcing reciprocal tariffs for countries that trade unevenly with the U.S. More on his sweeping plans that could reshape trade. Also on trade, from dumping products to forcing American companies to hand over technology. A look at Beijing's underhanded trade practices against the U.S. Trump's 25% tariff on imported cars and auto parts takes effect today, while one store owner who relies on imported parts says he isn't worried.
As far as the tariffs go, I really don't have a problem with them.
And illegal e-cigarettes from China are flooding the U.S., and their main market is American children. Most U.S. teenagers who vape use the Chinese products, which contain unknown chemicals and high levels of nicotine. President Trump announcing reciprocal tariffs for the worst offenders of fair trade, like Communist China. How will different countries feel the impacts? And why is the president declaring a national emergency? NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more.
President Trump announced his, quote, reciprocal tariffs plan, and that includes a 10% baseline tariffs to all countries, which will go into effect on April 5th, as well as what he calls reciprocal tariffs on the worst offenders of fair trade, and that will go into effect on April 9th. And meanwhile, Trump calls today a very important day in American history and a declaration of American economic independence. Watch.
This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence. For years, hardworking American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense. But now it's our turn to prosper.
And specifically, when it comes to the reciprocal tariffs, what it means is that the U.S. will now be charging half of what other countries are charging the U.S. in terms of both tariff and non-tariff trade barriers. For example, Trump showed a list of the reciprocal tariffs that he's charging to countries, which China is actually at the top of the list. He said that because China is charging the U.S. an equivalent of about 67% of tariffs, the U.S. will now be charging Chinese goods a 34% tariff. And he says that that is to reduce reliance on countries like China, which could create a national emergency that threatens the American way of life. Watch.
A single shipyard in China now produces more ships every year than all of the American shipyards combined. Think of that. And it was a business that we used to dominate. We used to dominate it totally. In short, chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life. It's a very
And when it comes to the 10% baseline tariffs that the U.S. will now be charging all countries starting April 5th, President Trump says that's to target practices of cheating. Earlier today, right before the Rose Garden event, a White House official on the preview phone call told us that, for example, China has been rerouting its goods to countries like Vietnam and Cambodia by sending their goods to warehouses there and then rebranding them as not made in China, and that to evade U.S. tariffs. So such a 10% tariffs is also targeting countries like China who are trying to evade potential punishment. So we see now today the both announcements, which Trump declares under a national emergency, both targeting countries, especially like Communist China. President Trump says that his goal is to, for example, make companies to come to the U.S. to produce their goods to avoid tariffs, and also for countries to drop their trade barriers and unfair trade practices. Watch.
Likewise to all of the foreign presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, ambassadors, and everyone else who will soon be calling to ask for exemptions from these tariffs, I say, terminate your own tariffs, drop your barriers, don't manipulate your currencies. They manipulate.
Meanwhile, some economists have warned that higher tariffs could lead to higher prices in the U.S. and adding to the burden of everyday Americans. But President Trump today pushing back against those predictions, saying that, for example, during his first term, he also enacted more tariffs, but the result wasn't positive. He says that such economists and even news outlets have been proven wrong, and they should look at the record of his first term to see what's going to happen this time around.
Out of all U.S. trade partners, Washington's largest trade deficit is with China. It totaled almost $300 billion last year. Washington blames a large part of that on what it calls Beijing's unfair trade practices. One example comes in the form of Chinese subsidies. Chinese companies that are backed by state subsidies can sell their products at prices so cheap that it's difficult for American companies to compete. It's a key method for Chinese companies to capture global market share and drive Western competitors out of business. The U.S. slapped tariffs on China in response, but Chinese companies have been getting around those tariffs by first shipping to third-party countries, then forwarding those goods to the U.S. Take a listen to what one American firm says about its battle against steel from China.
For years, we have battled unfairly traded imports of cast iron products. Heavily subsidized Chinese foundries operate below cost and dump these products in the United States far below fair market value. Over the course of the last 7 years, we have spent millions of dollars to avail ourselves of every legal remedy to stop dumping, illegal subsidies, transshipment, and customs fraud from Chinese producers who wish to take our jobs. We have filed and won anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, with duties ranging from 41 to 494%. To avoid paying these duties, Chinese producers transship their products through third countries, primarily Malaysia and Cambodia, where they are fraudulently labeled as originating from those nations. By our estimate, and to Betsy's point, we believe Customs has been unable to collect $51 million in duties owed on our products alone.
Another problem is technology transfer. In order to get access to the Chinese market, Western companies are forced to form joint ventures with local Chinese firms and hand over part of their technology. A notable example is the Westinghouse Electric Company, a once leading U.S. nuclear power developer. Westinghouse entered the Chinese market in the early 2000s. It was required to partner with a state-owned Chinese company to build nuclear power plants in China. The move was profitable at first, but under the deal, Westinghouse had to hand over thousands of documents about its nuclear power plant design. What's more, Chinese military hackers breached the Westinghouse system and stole even more trade secrets. China later turned to domestic firms for nuclear reactor designs. In 2017, Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy after years of losing profit. Forming joint ventures is only one of the regime's tactics for obtaining U.S. technology. Beijing has been stealing trade secrets from companies here at home through hacking and inserting spies. Victims include Google, Adobe, Boeing, T-Mobile, General Electric, and Coca-Cola. China has been a central focus for the Trump administration's trade policy. In February, President Trump imposing a 10% tariff on $400 billion in Chinese exports, then adding an additional 10% last month. What's on the horizon in the new round of tariffs for China, and which industries will likely be the primary target? NTD's Steve Lance was joined by Ed Butowski, managing partner of Chapwood Investments, to discuss.
The primary target is going to be electronics, because he's going after them for their piracy, but at the same time, the Chinese are able to make things much cheaper, and they do it with very, very low wages for their workers. So I think he's going to be going after technology with China, and I think there's certain companies that are going to be hurt more than others as a result of that. But I think China is going to get its fair share of tariffs without question.
Just to follow up on that, on his first day in office, President Trump unveiled the America First trade policy, which mandates officials to assess a bill that could revoke China's permanent normal trade relations status. Under this directive, what changes do you foresee in the future of U.S.-China trade relations?
I think it's going to be a constant negotiation and buffering back and forth, to see who, kind of falls apart on one area or not. I think the United States, I think what Trump is doing is very smart. Instead of having a kinetic war, he's using our biggest resource, which is our economy. And that is very, very smart. Since we're at a trade deficit with every country out there, this is a smart way of doing things. I just think the expectations that he's laid out for the United States is not reasonable. I think the United States is going to have a hard time with this for a longer period of time, and it's not going to be a quick fix in the economy like we saw in his first term.
I think you highlight an important point. The Chinese Communist Party, by all accounts, has infiltrated the United States, taken advantage of our free and open society, something which we cannot do. We can't go onto their Wall Street. We can't go to their universities and penetrate the way they have here and manipulates our society. So to your point, our economy and leveraging it is our biggest tool in the toolbox when it comes to non-kinetic national security. Ed Butowski, really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
How does the American auto industry feel about Trump's 25% tariffs on auto imports? We hear from an American auto parts distributor who sources the vast majority of his products from Taiwan. Watch.
Ernie Simmons owns an Atlanta store selling auto parts, one of the targets of U.S. President Donald Trump's latest tariff plans. His business, Aftermarket Auto Parts, relies heavily on imports from Taiwan. But Simmons says he's not worried.
As far as the tariffs go, I really don't have a problem with them. And the reason is, number one, I think that they're going to be temporary, because all that Trump is trying to do is make things equal. Whatever they charge us, we're going to charge them.
90% of Aftermarket's inventory is from Taiwan, according to Simmons, but he's optimistic that the tariffs will lead to a wider change.
I think there's going to be some pressure on us for a little while, but I also believe that these countries will come to the realization that they're not going to get a free ride anymore, and they're going to have to treat us when we export something to them the same way that we treat them when they import to us.
On Wednesday, Trump announced he'd make good on threats of new tariffs aimed at cars. He's planning a 25% import tax on vehicles not built in the U.S. to kick in next week. Then, duties on parts will roll out by May 3rd. Engines, transmissions, and electrical components are all identified as targets in a Trump proclamation. Vehicles and parts made in the U.S. will be exempt. While Simmons is brushing off the impact he'll feel, some experts say these tariffs could shake up the whole industry. Tibor Besedes, a professor of economics at Georgia Tech, says they create uncertainty across the supply chain.
Will there be a different administration 4 years down the road? They might do away with them, in which case they have to evaluate whether it makes sense to build a factory in the United States and then bring it online, and that might take anywhere up to 2 years, and then what happens if tariffs go away?
The tariffs, jumping from a current 2.5% to 25% rate on imported cars, take effect a minute after midnight on April 3rd on the U.S. East Coast.
Dr. Marty Makary is now at the helm of the Food and Drug Administration, and one component specifically brought up during Makary's confirmation hearing was the influx of illegal Chinese e-cigarettes or vapes into America. The key concern here isn't exactly the act of vaping itself, but the unregulated nature of these Chinese products. Their packaging and flavors are intentionally designed to entice children and teenagers, and no one knows exactly what chemicals are in them. To find out more, NTD's Fiona G spoke to Joel Thayer, president of the Digital Progress Institute and an attorney.
Joel, thank you so much for coming on today. I want to start by reading a quote from your article in the Daily Signal. Now, you wrote, quote, "To advance the MAHA agenda, one focus area for the FDA must be to stop the onslaught of unregulated illicit electronic cigarettes coming in from our most dangerous foreign adversary, China." So give us a scope here of this issue, Joel.
Well, it's pretty massive. We're seeing that China and Chinese manufacturers are exploiting yet another crisis that we're having. And in this case, they are leveraging the crisis at the border to essentially smuggle a bunch of illicit vapes into the mouths of every single American child.
So your article here also mentions this issue of regulatory incompetence. Based on that, how can Dr. Makary, as head of the FDA, really effectively address this?
really it just comes down to clarifying what is allowed and not allowed in the US. And also, there seemed to be a lack of coordination between the FDA and our border control. And so it allowed opportunistic Chinese manufacturers to not just leverage the ongoing crisis at the border, which now is getting a little bit more shored up with the Trump administration putting more emphasis on border control, but it also allowed these Chinese illicit manufacturers to essentially mislabel a lot of these vapes as being, just mere toys or even, batteries. That ultimately allowed them to slip through the cracks on a lot of this enforcement. And so, one thing that the FDA can do is not just clarification on just the general rules, but also more coordination with the border control to ensure that these manufacturers cannot continue to use our borders in the way that they have under the Biden administration.
According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, illegal Chinese-made vapes make up the majority of e-cigarettes used by teenagers in the U.S. Coming up, the U.S. State Department condemning Beijing's military drills around Taiwan. Reports say China deployed over 90 jets and ships to practice closing in on the island. A Chinese spy ship spotted off Australia's coast. Was it there to conduct scientific research or gather intelligence? The World Billionaires list for 2025 is out, and the United States is in the lead, followed by China. More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The Chinese military staged a second day of exercises around Taiwan on Wednesday, launching live fire strikes in the East China Sea and practicing blockade operations near crucial shipping lanes to the east and west of the island. Here are the details.
China escalated its military drills around Taiwan on Wednesday. It held long-range live-fire drills in the East China Sea. The exercises involved precision strikes on simulated targets of key ports and energy facilities, according to China's Eastern Theater Command. China gave a codename for the first time to its war games, which started Tuesday, Straight Thunder 2025A. State media CCTV said the exercises are a, quote, strong warning and a strong deterrent to the separatist forces of Taiwan independence. Chinese rhetoric has been building up against Taiwan President Lai Ching-te, who won the election last year and who rejects Beijing's sovereignty claims over Taiwan. The war games come after U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's Asia visit, during which he repeatedly criticized Beijing. The United States, which remains Taiwan's most important international backer and main arms supplier despite the lack of formal diplomatic ties, condemned China's exercises on Tuesday. In a statement, the U.S. State Department said China's aggressive military activities and rhetoric toward Taiwan only serve to exacerbate tensions and put the region's security and the world's prosperity at risk. Japan and the European Union also expressed concern. While the Taiwan government has denounced China for holding the drills, for most Taiwanese it's just another normal day. Taiwan has been under threat of Chinese invasion since 1949. Though Chen Yifan, an assistant professor of diplomacy and international relations at Taiwan's Tamkang University, says Taiwanese should be more aware of the threats coming from the mainland.
I think as a Taiwanese people, we have to worry about this because right now it's like, we are in the water pot and they are boiling the water gradually, step by step. But the problem right now is because the administration here in Taiwan, they are actually emphasizing they are trying their best to monitor all the situation. They do not really reveal all the reality to the public. So this is why also the public, we do not know why we should worry about the situation, because we don't have the sufficient information and transparency about the reality of the battleground.
Chen says China's drills may work in favor of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which may use the crisis to rally local support ahead of domestic elections next year.
How are Taiwanese people reacting to China's drills? Let's take a look.
We don't like it, of course. Trouble. They never give up. We don't know why.
I think if they will be war in between the strait, both sides will face to a very bad condition. The mainly concern is the people's life will go back to maybe 20 years ago.
Taiwan has denounced the drills as an irrational provocation and accused China of being, quote, a troublemaker. A Chinese intelligence ship was spotted off Australia's southern coast on Monday. An analyst suspects it of spying operations as part of Chinese military preparations. The ship has two main purposes: conducting scientific research and gathering intelligence. Senior analyst Malcolm Davis from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute expressed concern about the ship's path. It has been following the route of an undersea cable, a vital data highway that serves Australia's economy and infrastructure. These cables are critical because they connect Australia to the rest of the world. If they're cut, Australia would lose access to the internet, banking systems, and the stock market. Davis told Sky News, quote, "What we're talking about is the Chinese gathering intelligence on operational environments that they may want to operate in time of war." Australia's Prime Minister responded on Monday, saying the Australian Defence Force is actively monitoring the situation. Forbes has released its list of ranked billionaires for 2025, and one thing is overwhelmingly clear: the United States is in the lead, followed by China. NTD's Sean Marshall has the details.
The Forbes billionaire list for 2025 is out, and based on the numbers, the rich are getting significantly richer. There are now over 3,000 billionaires worldwide, 247 more than a year ago, worth $16.1 trillion in total, up by almost $2 trillion from 2024. The number of billionaires in the U.S. tops the world with a record 902. Then China is second with 516, including Hong Kong, and India is third with 205 billionaires. 15 out of 20 of the top billionaires on the Forbes list are located in the United States. Some of the most interesting new U.S. billionaires include Arnold Schwarzenegger at $1.1 billion, thanks to his many years of movie making, stocks, private equity, and real estate investments. Musician Bruce Springsteen at $1.2 billion, with 21 albums, and after selling his music catalog for $500 million to Sony. And comedian Jerry Seinfeld at $1.1 billion, getting a big boost of $500 million from a deal with Netflix to show his sitcom for more than 5 years, along with his many years of stand-up comedy and other streaming shows. The United States is the most successful at creating homegrown wealth and attracting immigrant, ultra-high net worth individuals. Events that happen in the U.S. like tariff adjustments and new technologies can easily shape global markets. And there's possibly some good news for the U.S. billionaires. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists reports that the IRS unit that audits billionaires has lost 38% of its employees since January. Sean Marshall, NTD News.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.